Good morning and welcome. My name is Bryce Campbell. I'm the Managing Director of the IISS US office, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to our event this morning with three of my distinguished colleagues from far-flung corners of the globe. We're very appreciative to have them here, as we are appreciative to have you here this morning, as well as those following on the webcast now or watching us on YouTube later. This event in particular is exciting to have because it really captures, I think, what a lot of the IISS attempts to do in bringing the international perspective to issues. And we're definitely doing that on a very topical issue this morning, looking at the cyber realm. I'm going to be introducing our speakers in the order they will be talking this morning. We're hoping to leave lots of time for questions and answers with the audience. So they'll be keeping their remarks to about 10 minutes. Eneken Tikk-Ringas is a senior fellow for cybersecurity at the IISS, and she has worked as a legal advisor and head of the legal and policy team at the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Tallinn, Estonia, prior to joining the IISS. She was one of the lead experts to analyze and write about cyber attacks against Estonia in 2007, and has since worked with many governments and international organizations on strategic cybersecurity matters. Next, to my direct left, will be Nigel Inkster, who is at the IISS the Director of Transnational Threats and Political Risk. After serving more than 30 years in the British Secret Intelligence Service, he was posted in Asia, Latin America, and Europe, and has worked extensively on transnational security issues. He was on the board of the SIS, commonly known as MI6, for 7 years, the last 2 of which he served as the Assistant Chief and Director of Operations, Director for Operations and Intelligence. He, as you know, is a frequent contributor and author on many aspects of cybersecurity, including on Chinese cybersecurity. Last will be, in the middle, Rafal Rohozinski, who is a consulting senior fellow for cybersecurity with the IISS. He is also the CEO of the SecDev Group and co-founder of the Information Warfare Monitor and the OpenNet Initiative, and serves on several boards, including the Canadian Association of Defense and Security Industries, Silent Circle, Access Now, and the Estonian E-Government Academy. So with that, I will turn it over to Eneken.
Thank you, and good morning. I will set the stage to our conversation by maybe framing why we should talk about others' views when it comes to cybersecurity strategic conversations these days, and then going into some of the points picked up from the Russian views. So the past year or so, on top of all the developments in the past decade or so, has, I think, introduced a growing sense of strategic insecurity in a man-made, but now we also have to realize more and more a man-mastered domain controlled by a few, and that results in a sort of anxiety over both past and future decision making under differences in still technological and strategic capabilities between countries and other players in this domain. So the question remains and or becomes one of global and regional strategic leadership and the ability to build and maintain trust and confidence. So therefore, when it comes to cybersecurity, we're really talking about the packed agenda. And many issues kind of tend to get lost in translation if we don't keep a close eye on them. So the event today tries to revisit some of the issues seen from different perspectives. Now, when it comes to others and the sort of major players in cyber and how they kind of approach decision making and discussions and the positions in this field, then we more and more realize how cyber decision-making or cyber affairs involve basically 200 countries. And as a good example, we in the upcoming UN First Committee talks about the first round of discussing cyber arms control. If you wish, we see Antigua and Barbuda as one of the members. Estonia is a small country, so potentially all countries will have a vote in how this domain is going to develop, and it's therefore essential to keep in mind that there are, by definition, no major or minor players, and the minor players are susceptible to become major if left unattended. And of course, the international dialogue has more and more nuance and benefits and suffers from greater awareness of both complexities and caveats. To maybe illustrate that, many see the wicked vote, the ITU vote in 2012 about whether the International Telecommunication Union should play a role in international cybersecurity as a sort of us against them vote. But in fact, countries on both sides had a variety of different reasons to vote for or against ITU's increasing role in cybersecurity and governmental oversight of this field. So I think the hint for all countries and players is that the standing coalitions are not very solid when it comes to strategic cyber issues, and instead the need for better coalition building, and this already sort of race for coalition building is going on. Now, the US, of course, is by definition a country difficult to relate to by the majority of other countries, and interestingly, I think in the cyber domains, it is becoming more of an issue than in other domains, where everyone sort of had or was deprived of equal opportunities for natural other than man-made reasons. And I think this time the angst against domain control and capability gap just may require a better sense of consideration and different leadership approaches. So a lot has been talked about the differences between the like-minded and I think the differences may not be the rightest or the best word to use when it comes to relationships between the EU and the US, because issues on the table again, such as data privacy, intelligence oversight, net neutrality, have been there for a long time and simply sort of keep reappearing as difficult differences to be reconciled and just kind of considered. But what is interesting is that more and more issues are now being brought to a judicial review, and that makes it just more difficult to get past issues such as SWIFT, the legality of the SWIFT sanctions, or data, the right to be forgotten by simply political talks. Other, I think, topics that merit attention when it comes to seeing things of different perspectives is that a topic that has been sort of often on and off the table is talks about around the cybercrime convention and whether this Council of Europe instrument is the right way to, or the only way to approach it. And whereas the coalition sort of, or the front seems to be fading on that end, there hasn't been any significant or kind of straightforward alternative agenda on the table. So while allies all seem to stand strong on the applicability or behind the applicability of international law in cyberspace, the applicability of law also remains an open question in its details. And current international discussion on norms doesn't necessarily give a true picture when it comes to sort of applicability of legal instruments, because the discussion mainly focuses on the political will to apply certain norms and maybe falls short in addressing norms that are not applied, although they exist, or norms that really do not exist. Maybe other points to kind of bring to the conversation and sort of that reflect some of the differences of mind is the role of industry in strategic cybersecurity, because there still is no clear stance about what the role of industry and civil society should be in providing strategic security. And maybe the threat or maybe the prospect to keep in mind is that potentially the industry as a more and more interested player can outplay governments as currently the most strategic players in this field. So we see rather good examples of working private-public partnerships in smaller and less ambitious countries, whereas it seems to be rather difficult to achieve in large and countries with big ambitions. So as to Russia, because my sort of role was also to reflect on some of the Russian views on this based on the conversations that Russia has had with other countries, then from Russian perspective, Russia has taken the stance that neither Russia nor the US will be the sort of number one cyber power in the future, probably hinting to the Chinese, the rise of China. And Russia has, well, you probably know that there are lots of cyber conferences and sort of venues to discuss cyber going on in the world, and Russia has tried to convene maybe lesser events, but really people attached to the elites, political elites of their countries, and discuss the topics, maybe hard topics, with communities that are likely to be part of the future decision making, and therefore building their coalition. It has been the assessment of the Russian elite diplomats in this field that the world has deteriorated, or the condition has gone worse than it was in 1998, when Russia first proposed the agenda of the arms control in cyberspace. And therefore, the question of how to avoid cyber warfare, how to control it, is still very much not resolved. Some of the views picked up from the Russian positions is that the US stands behind, like, marginalizing or has to do with marginalizing the European role in discussing strategic cybersecurity issues with Russia, therefore hinting that countries try to keep cyber security talks very much on bilateral level and not bring hard issues to international fora, and taken from their perspective, the US tries to focus on bilateral talks instead of international breakthroughs. Also, Russian stance has been very much that international law needs to be changed, and that there are no real answers in how the incidents are currently approached by countries under the applicable or existing instruments. So, a few thoughts to start with. I pass it over to Nigel for China comments.
Okay, thanks very much, Eneken. Well, all right. It's certainly the case that in sheer numbers, China is well on the way to being perhaps the major global cyber power, if you're simply looking at the number of its citizens that are actually connected one way or another, in excess of 600 million, 80% of them through mobile technology. When it comes to China's perceptions of the US in the cyber domain, obviously we need to look at that as a subset of China's broader strategic perspectives in relation to the United States. And these increasingly are being seen in terms of kind of strategic context, with China having a long-term ambition to secure effective strategic parity with the United States by the middle of the current century, but also very much concerned by a perception that the United States is seeking to constrain China's rise through various means, including a network of bilateral alliances with surrounding states, but also using the cyber domain. And this perception of threat and vulnerability that China has in relation to the USA in cyber is not something I think we can underestimate, or we can't make too much of it, if you like. because although China obviously prays it in aid of international postures, this is a real and deeply felt perception. If you look back, for example, an op-ed in the People's Liberation Army daily newspaper back in 2009, the main points made in this editorial are: the West enjoys total dominance over the internet due to its ownership of the majority of hardware and software. It seeks to use the internet to spread subversion and promote its own worldview. The failed colour revolutions of 2009 were largely instigated by Western social media, such as Twitter and Facebook, and having achieved domination in the land, sea, air and space domains, the United States is attempting to achieve similar dominance in the cyber domain and is largely responsible for militarizing cyberspace through the establishment of the US Cyber Command. I think that represents a pretty widespread perception, certainly within China's strategic community. And I would say in parenthesis that although it's fairly normal within China for public discourse to be more uniform than you would typically find in the West, I think in respect of cybersecurity, that level of uniformity of view is probably higher than for any other topic that I can identify, and probably does reflect the reality of perceptions at the moment. So for China, the real issue is, how does one deal with this perception of absolute dominance within the cyber domain? And of course, all the Snowden revelations have simply served to reinforce that perception of US dominance and relative Chinese vulnerability. China hasn't actually made that much of the Snowden revelations in its own right. Obviously, these things have been covered to a significant degree in the cyber media. But Chinese officialdom has been fairly sparing in references to the Snowden revelations, though in the last month or so, since the indictments of the 5 3PLA officers by the Department of Justice, we have actually seen a kind of uptick in Chinese commentaries on Snowden. And I quote from a speech that was made by the Chinese Vice Foreign Minister at an event I attended in Beijing a couple of weeks ago, which contained the following paragraph: the mass surveillance activities by a particular country, in Chinese 个别的国家, has severely infringed other countries' sovereignty and their citizens' privacy. A particular country has exercised double standards on the cyber issue, drawn lines around its own selfish concerns, and concocted regulations applicable only to other countries. Instead of reflecting on its behaviours that undermine the sovereignty of other countries and the privacy of their citizens, it has depicted itself as a victim and has made groundless accusations against or defamed other countries. This kind of hypocritical and hegemonic behaviour must be corrected. So, United States government, please take note. At the end of May, we also saw China releasing, the Chinese Internet Media Research Center releasing a report in both Chinese and English entitled A Record of US Global Surveillance Activities, which sets out in exhaustive detail, though without any attempt at context, the principal revelations made by Snowden. Two things, two key factors of the Chinese response that I would briefly want to highlight, and then I will pass the baton to Rafal. Firstly, the Snowden revelations have reinvigorated a long-running debate within China on indigenous innovation, in other words, replacing an almost total reliance on Western-designed software and hardware with indigenous products. This is making pretty slow progress at the moment. Chinese government dependence on Microsoft software, often not of a licensed variety, is still pretty pervasive. And efforts to replace IBM mainframe computers with Chinese indigenous alternatives are making very little headway. There is one Chinese company, Zhongbia, that provides software for the Chinese military and some other government departments, but it's pretty clunky, limited functionality, a tendency to fall over, rather reminiscent of the systems that we used to be reliant on in government during the 1990s. The other area where China is, of course, very active is in the international diplomatic arena, broadly subscribing to Russian initiatives on areas like the Code of Conduct, but by and large playing second fiddle, allowing Russia to take the lead. And what we are seeing now, I think in particular in relation to issues like the governmental group of experts to which Eneken made references, is that China is playing a very, very cautious and pragmatic hand, seeking to build relationships, tactical alliances where possible, testing the boundaries of what is possible, but not being too forward-leaning in espousing any particular activity, raising questions, for example, about the applicability of the law of armed conflict in relation to international law and the cyber domain, but again, evincing a rather more pragmatic approach than we're currently seeing from Russia. And I think we can expect China to continue to play a long game with the overarching strategic purpose of seeking to erode US strategic control of this domain. I'll pass the baton to Rafal at this point.
Thank you, Nigel. Just before I start, I was intrigued by something that Eneken said during her opening remarks when she said that we need to see cyberspace as a man-mastered domain. And I thought to myself, well, that's rather intriguing, and perhaps I should put on my gender hat and make for the record a statement that in Canada, our version of the NSA actually has two extremely powerful women basically running the shop. So I think I call it a person-mastered domain. First of all, I'd like to say that the take I'd like to take in my remarks is somewhat different than that taken by both Eneken and Nigel. I think cybersecurity is difficult, and it has been difficult since the dawning of the cyber age around 1991, because pretty well any activity that occurs on it requires international cooperation, or at least cooperation amongst individuals that make this synthetic domain operate across boundaries. We've had a problem that the ability to be able to scale rulemaking in a way that allows cooperation to happen functionally on networks has not kept pace with the expansion of these networks in and of themselves. That was certainly true up until May 2013, when a number of processes were in place through bilateral, multilateral means to try to address this issue of rulemaking. Then May happened. In May we had Mr. Edward Snowden make his revelations about the activities of the US government that occurred under national security law within cyberspace, which I think was a fairly fundamental disruptive factor. It was a disruptive factor domestically because at its core what it pitted or opened up was a very fundamental debate between the relationship between citizens and states, where individual liberty and collective security find boundaries within rulemaking that is acceptable within existing conventional and constitutional law. That's how we essentially framed the debate about how we understand stuff. Invariably, that issue about the intrusiveness of the state, the right of the state, the rule of law as applied to the activities of states in the national security domain has been a boon for the bilateral relationship between the United States and China, the United States and Russia, who for their own reasons were seeking to get traction from a national point of view or from a national control point of view over a domain which they felt quite rightly was not something that they completely controlled. Didn't control it because the technology was largely grafted and imported. didn't really control it because of the fact that the rulemaking apparatus that we have to deal with, for example, telecommunications, did not extend into the management of this domain that increasingly was supporting many of the functions of government, public administration, social civil society, as well as trade. But my interest has been not so much in the grand politics of how the Snowden revelations have played out on the cybersecurity agenda of the bilateral powers or the big powers that deal with it, but rather how it's impacted on the smaller states. And in particular, my interest has been in the former Soviet states of anyone but Russia. These states are interesting because of the fact that they represent a fairly significant voting bloc internationally, contain a fairly large population, and also interestingly straddle both the European Union as well as the Asian region. And I'd like to sort of focus my remarks in terms of 5 observations that have been made about how the Snowden revelations and their impact on cybersecurity is manifested. The first is probably the issue that is best summarized as the mouse that roared. Although we've seen a tremendous amount of reverberation in terms of popular press and popular culture around what Snowden revelations have brought out as far as the citizen-state relationship, we certainly have not seen the equivalent at all in the post-Soviet states outside of Russia. This really can be brought down, I think, to 2 things. First of all, although we have seen a lot about the Snowden revelations because of the great work of the Guardian, the New York Times, and Mr. Glenn Greenwald, there hasn't really been an equivalent in the Russian language. While it has been covered in the press, access to the actual material that was being revealed and explanation of it in terms of an interpretation just hasn't happened. Quite a bit has happened in social media, but that social media space has not really been something that has crossed boundaries enough to become really a popular debate. The other thing is that main aspect of the Snowden revelations really brought to the fore in the US, UK, and you might say the Five Eyes community, really has not reverberated in Russia because the notion of privacy, or the notion of privacy in general in the post-Soviet space, is very, very different. These are societies that are ruled by permit. In order to live in a particular city, you have to be registered in that city. Identity documents are something that you're granted from birth. They follow you through death, and essentially the Kafkaesque bureaucracy still lives in its post-Soviet format. In other words, there's not the same reasonable expectation of privacy in real life, much less in anything that occurs in cyberspace itself. It's also true that has very much translated itself into online relationships. Contactia, which is one of the largest social media platforms in the post-Soviet space, is sort of like a Facebook that would have existed had there been no privacy legislation and no regard to copyright. In other words, the expectation of people putting information out on these particular social platforms is much, 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 much lower than even the modicum of privacy that people expect here. So again, on one hand, because of the fact that simply these things are not talked about in the popular press. Secondly, because notions of privacy are different. The popular reception of Snowden has been very, very different than that, and very much muted than it has been in Europe and in North America. The second interesting observation about the consequence of the Snowden revelation has been the fact that there's been a growing openness among the security forces responsible for signals intelligence in saying, yes, in fact, we do this in the former Soviet Union. This has largely been, from my observations, for 2 reasons. In those countries that are seeking to harmonize their legislation within that of the European Union, this is a great opportunity in order to open up a kind of quasi-public debate around how to reformulate lawful access, lawful intercept legislation, which on one hand seemingly follows European norms, but at the same time is stacked very heavily towards the state. So it's kind of an openness to say, yes, we are doing lawful intercept, but in a sense rewriting the legislation which permits them to do things which up to now have happened under administrative fiat. The other aspect of it is that in some Central Asian countries, the interception of communications is actually a political capital. And the fact that the security apparatus can now say, yes, we intercepted, and by the way, we can also make it available to you, is almost a calling card for business that previously wasn't acceptable or wasn't available. Third observation is that this has also had cascading effects into the private sector. For those of you who do read the RUNet or the Russian internet, you might be familiar with a site called kompromat.ru, which basically means compromise.ru, which has in the past put out long transcripts of intercepted GSM communications, chats between lovers, both pictures of foreign deputy ministers of the interior and their girlfriends in saunas, and basically deals in that kind of muckraking information that really only could be gotten through interception of private communication. So the surveillance industry has almost come out in the former Soviet Union now saying, look, we can do exactly the same thing as the NSA does, and by the way, come and hire us. So perversely, rather than creating a disincentive and an argument for privacy, it's actually created an incentive for business to fill in and do the state itself. The fourth observation is that in the past year, one of the things that has been prompted by disclosures, notwithstanding his status as a political refugee in Russia, has been a crackdown on cyberspace by states within the former Soviet Union. In other words, a recognition that the reason why this domain was getting so much attention from organizations such as the NSA is because this is a domain through which you can get perspective on the actions and motivations of individuals. And by turning their attention to that, there was also a recognition that this is a domain that requires state attention, maybe in the way that the physical domain is as well. In Russia, we've seen a fairly repressive law passed on the requirement of bloggers and people using social media to register online. We've seen restrictions against social media platforms in many of the other former Soviet countries. We've seen the imposition or legislation put forward for the creation of national digital boundaries and borders. So generally, there's an enclosure act of cyberspace that has been greatly accelerated in the former Soviet Union as a result of the last years. That's also had reverberations in terms of the global governance of cyberspace. Russia, as Eneken has noted for quite some time, joined by China, has been pushing for at least the last 7 years to bring the governance of the internet under the legislation or under the legislative authority of the ITU. And this is by and large because the ITU represents still a Westphalian model of governance where nation states have precedence in terms of setting rules, where boundaries and borders can be set and respected, and those essentially are the natural containers for the governance of cyberspace. And again, the process of acceleration towards that model of governance has certainly had its heyday, given all the processes I've mentioned. So, paradoxically, although Edward Snowden's motivations may well have been to defend the Constitution of the United States, to defend the individual liberty against the encroachment of the state, unfortunately, his consequences of his actions, especially in the countries that I've looked at, has been quite the opposite, which is to accelerate the process of effectively increasing state power and enclosure of the internet, bringing it far, far away from the ideal of a vehicle for individual empowerment. Now, is this going to change over time? I would be a pessimist if I said no, that this is the trajectory downwards. I think there are many things playing against this, including just the demographics of cyberspace, which in and of themselves are forcing a degree of change. But certainly, it's an interesting case study for cybersecurity of unintended consequences becoming the consequences of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, all three of you. That was a lot to take in. I'm sure we have a lot of questions, so I will go ahead and turn to the floor now. We'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. I just ask you to introduce yourselves, state your affiliation, and keep your questions to the form of a question. Anyone want to get the ball rolling? Yes. Ian.
Ian Willis.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Please wait for the microphone.
Ian Willis of the Brookings Institution. I wonder if the panelists could comment on the likely prospect of a unopposed election for Secretary General of the ITU of a Chinese official, and what the implications and significance of that might be.
Well, why don't we let our panelists each take that in turn and allow the audience to think of other questions while they respond to the first question. Eneken, you want to start and we'll work back this way?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have like a good educated answer. That what I have observed is that there has been like well, it doesn't seem to be like a race towards that position anyway. And on the other hand, just from the past, I think it hasn't greatly mattered in a way that nationality of the head of ITU, of course, matters from a national perspective, but from international perspective, that it has always been made clear. For example, when there was this kind of the race towards getting domain names to ITUs or under ITUs ages, then countries have always taken very strong stances when it comes to the mandate of ITU and what is sort of desirable or not. And I think that will continue. Of course, from the Chinese perspective, China has, well, to my understanding, been very clear that they want some more clarity to and more like openness and equality to how those outstanding problems will be solved in the future. But I think it has now become a common agenda to first set the ITU's exact role in internet governance and but more importantly to look into existing ICANN mechanisms and how they can improve without transferring the sort of mechanism to any other organization. So I don't think it will kind of make great or major changes in how ITU will function or which role it will take.
No, I think to add to that, the ability of the ITU to make much progress in terms of taking over internet governance is obviously a function of member states, and with some member states adamantly opposed to that, with the USA in the lead. I think that there are limits on what might be possible. I mean, just two observations. One is that China, broadly speaking, within the international community, is underrepresented relative to its size and influence, and so in one sense it's perhaps not surprising if China's starting to put forward more candidates for some of these posts. And in many ways it would be seen within China, I think, as beneficial to have this additional arrow in their quiver, even if its immediate utility was not apparent.
Other questions from the floor? Yes. In the back.
Hello, Tal Copen with Politico Pro Cybersecurity. I'm curious, you spoke about how the May indictments have really changed China's position in the cyber domain and their relation to the Snowden revelations, and I'm curious if you could expand a little bit more about what you think the ramifications of these indictments might be. Will they actually serve a U.S. end, or will they have a counter effect?
Well, in relation to the last part of your question, it may be that there are people in this audience who can answer that question better than I can, because I'm struggling to ascertain whether these indictments were in fact part of a really sort of thought through and structured strategy in which the escalatory process has been thoroughly mapped out. I'm not yet convinced that is the case. And I think from the Chinese perspective, obviously the indictments caused something of a shock, because it's always a shock when the activities of your intelligence services are set out in such dramatic and granular detail. And also the impact on the People's Liberation Army was quite significant in terms of questions of face. The chief of PLA General Staff had been in Washington a week before these indictments were opened, and nobody had given him any warning that this was coming. But I think from the Chinese perspective, my expectation is that they will probably try to cauterize this incident and avoid getting dragged into an escalatory process if they possibly can. And I think it's important to understand that from the Chinese perspective, they really do not buy into US government arguments that there is a distinction to be made between this kind of industrial espionage at scale and the sort of thing that the United States does. Yes, it's true that, of course, China has signed the trade-related intellectual property rights treaty, which commits it to protecting intellectual property. But in from China's perspective, they look at the sort of relationship that they've got with their state-owned enterprise system. They look at the sort of relationship the US government, the NSA, has got with the US private sector, Microsoft, Google, Verizon, etc., and they really do see no difference. The other thing, of course, from the Chinese perspective is that they have a dramatic economic imperative to carry on doing this stuff because it's from their perspective a way to help avoid falling into a middle income trap, which is something that China's economic planners worry about quite a lot. So I think that, as I said, I think the Chinese response is probably going to be to try to cauterize this wound if they can, and not allow it to escalate. But I think they also calculate that they've got probably some quite important cards in terms of their leverage against potential US allies in this endeavor. I think that, for example, European countries will be very unenthusiastic about associating themselves with this latest US enterprise, and it's not at all evident to me that the US government has actually sought to brigade an international alliance to promote this approach.
If I might, just a quick follow-up question. So if the US doesn't have a coalition in its approach dealing with China, does China have allies in Russia or elsewhere that are in its camp that are more vocal and or ready to push back?
I don't think they've got allies, and I think on this particular incident, this particular question of the indictments, I think China are pretty much on their own. I don't see any evidence that any other major state is particularly keen to be associated with this, because I think this is, in many ways, a uniquely Chinese problem. Yes, other countries, Russia in particular, is now starting to be more visible in terms of involvement in large-scale industrial espionage against the West, but the scale is still very much less than what we've been witnessing from China for the last half dozen plus years.
Just sort of look at it from the legal perspective. I think the legal case value of this effort is lesser than the political one, of course. And especially when we talk about the European approach to it, I think overall more countries would approach the issue of industrial espionage. Yes, case by case, nation to nation, but mostly so the logical approach would still be by strengthening IT security and maybe looking into existing and potentially needed ways of enforcing intellectual property laws. So meaning it has been a bold move, and not many countries, I guess, will follow.
I just add one thing, which again is maybe an observation of what I didn't make about the other post-Soviet countries, but certainly one of the things that the Snowden revelations brought to the fore, and I would probably say that the indictment of the PLA officers is accelerated, is also an incentive for lesser states to start pursuing an external signals intelligence capability that they previously didn't have. It's just a bit of a wake-up call, and this maybe is an important element of state power that they previously didn't have access to, that the opportunity cost to do so is a lot lower given the fact that at least part of the playbook is now evident, and that the ability to be able to project power in ways that simply are not possible, given limited scale and physical space, is also within their grasp. So certainly that's something that's come to the fore as a debate. Paradoxically, again, not to limit the activity in the way that maybe the intention was by outing the officers of the PLA, but rather as creating an incentive to say, hey, maybe we should get into this game to begin with. So perhaps the spy games are only just beginning.
And is the impact of that more on the domestic or regional level, or does that eventually encroach to smaller actors conducting industrial espionage in the United States and other major players as well?
Well, it's interesting because it ties into another initiative that IMSS is undertaking, which is sort of looking at the cyber domain in terms of the development of what we call military cyber or state cyber capabilities. And it's certainly within this sort of emerging taxonomy, there's this idea of capabilities which are largely being created for national security domestic purposes, and those which are being deliberately structured for expeditionary purposes. Whether those expeditionary purposes fit in within, to use the U.S. categorization, Title 10 or Title 50, is sort of TBD, to be determined depending on country by country. But I think the merits and the advantages of both approaches have been clearly understood, and the opportunity cost of getting into this game as opposed to, let's say, building a carrier are far, far lower.
Mike Macetic, PBS Online NewsHour. I want to take this back to the internet. I guess my overall question, and particularly in terms of what Mr. Inkster said about the Chinese view of the internet as basically a Western instrumentality. Overall, where we are at this moment and some years into the future, does offense beat defense? In other words, how successful can they and other countries really build a firewall, or from what we've seen, that clever people can always figure out a way to get around the firewall?
So let's actually, I think there was at least one other question. Let's take that now. Yeah, in the back.
Jack James from Johns Hopkins. I wanted to reference the fact that tomorrow morning in Berlin there's going to be a major meeting between the German team and the American team to work out the kinks between the country that has been most sensitive to this issue. Mr. Inkster, my question to you is, how can the U.S. deal with that particular relationship when 28 countries can't even get their act together, or 27, and particularly with British involvement in other areas of surveillance? How is there going to be a consensus created in Europe if the United States is looking for one, and how long will that take?
Well, two questions to me: offense versus defense. I think it's interesting to reflect that this question is being asked as we approach the 100th anniversary of World War I, a conflict which was characterized by an overwhelming conviction by militaries at that time that offense was the answer, whereas it turned out that in industrial era warfare, actually defense was the answer. And I think that in a way it's invidious to make that to try and form a judgment, because the first thing to say is that the cyber domain as currently engineered and structured is always going to contain vulnerabilities. Even if a particular software system is well engineered, it will still have vulnerabilities, and of course that software system has to interact with other software systems which may be less well engineered, and so on and so forth. So there are always going to be vulnerabilities. And I think, from my perspective, obviously offense achieves in one sense, particularly in the espionage sense, when you've got into the other guy's network and you've sucked out all the information, you've done what you needed to do, and there really isn't much in the way of comeback. But in kind of broader applications of cyber conflict, let's call it that, I think we may find that in the long haul, the advantage lies with whoever has the most capacity for resilience and recovery. The systems can always be taken out, but one of the key criteria, I think, for survivability is how robust you can be in standing up against systems that have been taken out or degraded. On the European point, well, I think in a fantasy world, if President Obama were to ring up Angela Merkel and say, Angela, you're in, welcome to the Six Eyes, I actually do think that would draw a lot of the venom from the relationship that has arisen between the United States and Germany. The thing about Five Eyes is it's the best club there is, and everybody is resentful about the fact that they're not part of it. I think that there are two aspects to this in the European dimension. One is the reality that actually on the ground there has been a lot of effective practical cooperation between European intelligence services and their US counterparts. When some initial rather excitable and breathless headlines emerged about large quantities of French, Spanish, German data being shared with, being acquired by NSA, it turned out that this was done by the intelligence services of the countries concerned, with at least the presumed approval of their governments. The other side of this, of course, is a political aspect, which in Germany has a very strong dimension. The German government is in the process of drafting legislation requiring German government departments procuring cloud computing services to get assurances that none of this information will be made accessible to foreign intelligence services, for example. But I think that probably this situation can, over time, be damped down by some U.S. concessions on privacy, or some U.S. concessions to European data privacy concerns. I have to say, my own perspective of European data privacy legislation, Eneken may well want to say something, is that it feels to me a bit like the regulations we used to have when horseless carriages were first introduced and men with red flags were required to walk in front of them. I don't think that European data privacy legislation, things like right to forget, are remotely fit for purpose in the internet era. So I think that this is something that's going to play out over a long period of time. But I do think that the geopolitical realities will move in the direction of damping down this controversy and delivering pragmatic outcomes for intelligence cooperation where it's needed.
If I may just jump on a hobby horse, the gentleman here made the question about what trumps in the internet age, offensive or defense. I think it's neither. It's maneuver that really trumps. It's your ability to be able to work within this synthetic domain in order to create effects. And if you assume that maneuver is really what defines an ability to act effectively in cyberspace, then the ability to maneuver is defined by your ability to be able to leverage intelligence to know what your opponent is doing and what their next move should be. Cybersecurity is all about an intelligence-led activity. That, by far, is more important than anything else, and I think it's specifically important to the internet because it is a synthetic domain, because it is uniquely malleable at the technical level, the policy level, at the infrastructure level, at the code level, right across the board. I think that's the aspect that we really haven't done right.
Right, and then in front of you, the two questions are interlinked now. Meaning, when it comes to the Western instrumentality, I would just point out that as much as there is divergent views about where to go and what is important, then there are still common goals. I think that we can build on, and in a sort of logical lineup, there would be everybody still seems to want the economic growth that would come out of trusted and working international or global digital markets. Then I guess the overall goal very much still is no destabilization, and of course, and we are moving, or we kind of getting more traction in, for example, prospect of agreeing on certain off-limit targets, such as the banking system. So I would too say that it probably will not be a question about the offense versus defense. There will still be aspects that remain attractive to the military domain. There will be a lot of intelligence capabilities discussion to be done, and at the same time we have to, and we will be returning to economic conversations about cyberspace. But then on the EU account, it's an interesting situation evolving, because right now it seems that the EU privacy approach, no matter how horses and carriages it is, it's not going away easily. And on the other hand, the US currently benefits of certain political level agreed safe zones, such as the Safe Harbor Agreement, the PNR. So those, again, seem to be surfacing over and over again. And I think the question here becomes not whether the European or the US approach will prevail, because we see that both approaches have their flaws. So I see a good prospect here in fact, international or global privacy talks that the UN sort of has already opened the door to. So in that sense, I think the question of data protection is very much open.
Well, that was excellent. We're near the end of our time. This has been very interesting, and I think we can all take away that this is certainly an evolving situation, a constantly changing landscape. We didn't even talk about what potential new technologies might disrupt what we're already talking about. But this is definitely something that will command our attention for years to come. So thank you all three. Quickly before we go, just a little bit of housekeeping. Some of you might have also received an invitation to our open house this evening. It'll be a chance to meet some of our fellows, such as Nigel and other scholars here at the IISS, and hear about our upcoming schedule, meet some of our current members, and learn a little bit more about the Institute. Tomorrow we'll be doing an event on a possible Asian arms race, featuring our senior fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security, Christian Lemire. That's at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, if that would be of interest. Otherwise, thank you all for coming this morning. Thank you for your questions, and please join me in thanking our panelists.